The Valdorian Empire had ruled the stars for 300 years. They had conquered 17 star systems and crushed any species that refused to kneel before them. Their warships were massive beasts of metal and fire. Their weapons could burn entire continents in minutes. No civilization had ever defeated them. No species had ever made them taste defeat. They moved through the galaxy like a plague, consuming everything in their path. High Admiral Zoroth stood on the command deck of his flagship and studied the holographic display floating before his eyes. His intelligence officers had brought him reports about a small planet in a quiet corner of space. The planet was called Earth. It was a tiny blue marble orbiting an ordinary yellow star. The creatures who lived there called themselves humans. Zoroth examined the data with casual interest. These humans were a young species. They had only recently learned to leave their own world. Their technology was laughably primitive by Valdorian standards. They possessed no faster-than-light engines. They had no energy shields. Their weapons were crude projectile systems and chemical explosives. Their entire military fleet consisted of a few hundred small vessels that a single Valdorian cruiser could destroy without effort. But the intelligence reports contained something unusual. These humans spent most of their existence fighting amongst themselves. Their entire history was written in blood. They waged wars over territory and resources and abstract ideas. They invented new weapons with frightening speed, always seeking better methods to kill their own kind. They had even created devices capable of destroying their entire civilization and had come close to using them. Zoroth found this behavior strange. His own species had evolved on a tranquil world where survival depended on cooperation. The Valdorians had learned violence as a tool for expansion, but it was not woven into their nature. These humans seemed to breathe violence like air. They were born in conflict and raised in struggle. It did not matter. Primitive savages with crude weapons posed no threat to the Empire. The decision to conquer Earth was simple. The planet possessed minerals and water that the Empire required. The humans would serve as slave labor once their spirits were crushed. And the conquest would demonstrate Valdorian power to any species foolish enough to consider resistance. Zoroth assigned 9,500 warships to the invasion. It was excessive force for such a weak target, but the Admiral believed in overwhelming displays of strength. Fear was a useful weapon. When other species saw what happened to Earth, they would submit without resistance. The fleet departed from the staging grounds near the Valdorian home system. 9,500 vessels spread across the void like an iron curtain. Each ship measured over 2 kilometers in length. Each carried enough destructive power to shatter a moon. The crews were relaxed and confident. They had performed this duty many times before. They expected the humans to surrender immediately or die quickly. On Earth. The first warning arrived at 3:17 in the morning. Admiral Daniel Carter was sleeping in his private quarters at United Earth Defense Force headquarters when his emergency communicator erupted with noise. He grabbed the device and heard the trembling voice of Lieutenant Kate Morrison calling from the Deep Space Monitoring Station orbiting Jupiter. Something massive was coming. The sensors had detected 9,500 vessels traveling at faster than light speeds. They were heading directly for Earth. Estimated arrival was 48 hours. Carter felt ice spreading through his veins. He had dedicated his entire career to preparing for this moment while praying it would never arrive. Humanity had always suspected they were not alone among the stars. They had detected strange signals from distant systems. They had found mathematical patterns in cosmic radiation, but contact had never been established. No visitors had ever come. Now visitors were coming, and they were bringing 9,500 warships. The governments of Earth assembled an emergency session within hours. Leaders from every nation gathered in a fortified bunker beneath the mountains of Switzerland. They stared at sensor displays, showing the approaching fleet, and listened to military experts explain the situation. General Scott Palmer delivered the defense assessment. His voice remained steady, but his hands were not. Humanity possessed 412 combat-capable vessels. Most were converted mining ships hastily equipped with experimental weapons. They carried railguns and missile launchers and prototype-directed energy systems, but they were small and fragile compared to what was coming. 412. Ships against 9,500. The mathematics told a brutal story. Humanity could not win a direct battle. They could not even delay the enemy for long. The alien armada would crush their defenses like a boot crushing an insect. Earth would fall within hours of the first engagement. Several leaders proposed immediate surrender. Perhaps negotiation was possible. Perhaps they could offer tribute in exchange for survival. Perhaps existence under alien rule was preferable to extinction. Admiral. Carter listened to these voices and felt something ancient stirring in his chest. It was fury. It was defiance. It was the same fire that had burned in human hearts since the first. Ancestor picked up a stone to defend their family. He rose and addressed the assembly. Surrender meant slavery. Slavery meant the death of everything humanity had built and dreamed and sacrificed for, across 10,000 years of civilization. Their ancestors had bled for freedom on countless battlefields. They had died rather than submit to tyrants. They had passed that stubborn flame from generation to generation. That flame would not be extinguished by aliens. The chamber fell quiet. Carter looked at the faces surrounding him and watched the fear transform into something harder. Something older. Something that had carried humanity through ice ages and plagues and world wars. A young woman named Lisa Grant requested permission to address the council. She was a civilian entrepreneur who had made her fortune designing autonomous systems for asteroid mining. Her mind worked in ways that military planners could not match. She proposed a different kind of war. Humanity could not compete in firepower or numbers, but humanity possessed knowledge that no alien species could understand. Humans had spent their entire existence perfecting the craft of killing each other, not the orderly conquest of empires, but the desperate, bloody struggle for survival against superior enemies. Guerrilla warfare, ambush tactics, improvised weapons, psychological operations, deception and misdirection, and the absolute refusal to accept defeat. The aliens expected a conventional battle. They expected the humans to arrange their pathetic fleet in neat formations and die with dignity. They expected quick surrender or a quick annihilation. They would receive neither. The next 48 hours witnessed something extraordinary. Nations that had threatened each other with nuclear weapons now shared their military secrets freely. Factories across every continent converted to wartime production. Scientists abandoned their research to develop new weapons. Engineers worked without sleep to upgrade every vessel that could fly. Civilians volunteered by the millions for any task that needed doing. Humanity had always been fractured by borders and languages and ancient hatreds, but facing extinction, they remembered what they had forgotten. They were one tribe, one family, one species standing together on a small blue world that was the only home they had ever known. Admiral Carter watched the preparations with cautious hope growing in his heart. The odds remained impossible. The enemy remained overwhelming. But something had changed in the human spirit. They were no longer afraid. They were angry, and the aliens had no idea what angry humans were capable of. Doing the Valdorian fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Beyond the orbit of Mars, 9,500 warships arranged themselves in the traditional conquest formation that had terrified 16 civilizations into submission. The vessels spread across millions of kilometers of space, creating an approaching wall of destruction that blotted out the stars behind them. High Admiral Zoroth stood on his command platform and observed the small blue planet in the distance. Earth looked peaceful and fragile. He could see the swirling white clouds and the deep blue oceans. It reminded him of a delicate ornament that would shatter at the slightest touch. He ordered his communications officer to transmit the standard surrender demand. The message was simple and direct. The humans could submit to Valdorian rule and serve the Empire as a labor species, or they could resist and face complete annihilation. They had 1 hour to respond. The response came in 12 minutes. Admiral Daniel Carter appeared on the viewscreen, his face calm and his eyes cold. He spoke 3 words that the Valdorian translators struggled to interpret properly. "Come and take it." Zorath felt a flicker of annoyance. This defiance was unexpected, but ultimately meaningless. He ordered the first assault wave to advance. 500 warships surged forward, their weapons charging, and their crews eager for the easy victory that awaited them. The Valdorian tactical doctrine was simple and proven. They would advance in formation, crush any resistance with overwhelming firepower, and accept the enemy's surrender. This approach had worked against every species they had encountered. There was no reason to expect different results here. But the humans did not follow the expected script. The space between Mars and Earth was empty. No human vessels moved to intercept the advancing fleet. No defensive positions revealed themselves. The 500 Valdorian ships continued forward, sensors sweeping for targets and finding nothing. Commander Chris Bennett floated in darkness. Watching his tactical display and counting seconds, his squadron of 23 converted mining vessels was hidden inside hollowed asteroids in the belt between Mars and Jupiter. They had powered down all systems except passive sensors. They were invisible, cold, and patient. The Valdorian assault wave passed the asteroid belt without slowing. They were focused on Earth, confident that no threat existed behind them. They were wrong. Bennett gave the signal. 23 ships erupted from their rocky shells and accelerated at maximum thrust. They struck the rear of the Valdorian formation like wolves attacking a herd from behind. Their railguns punched through unshielded engine sections. Their missiles found gaps in the defensive screens. 80 Valdorian vessels exploded or lost power before the enemy even understood what was happening. Then Bennett and his squadron vanished back into the asteroid field. The Valdorian commanders were confused. This was not proper warfare. The humans should have stood and fought. They should have presented themselves for honorable destruction. Instead, they attacked without warning and fled before retaliation was possible. Zorath ordered a pursuit force of 200 ships to enter the asteroid field and destroy the human attackers. The pursuit vessels accelerated into the rocky maze. Their sensors searching for heat signatures and engine emissions, they found something else entirely. For 30 years, humanity had been preparing the asteroid belt for exactly this scenario. Thousands of automated weapons platforms had been disguised as ordinary rocks. Mining charges had been positioned throughout the field. Sensor drones tracked every movement. The asteroid belt was not empty space filled with debris. It was a trap. The weapons platforms activated simultaneously. Energy beams and kinetic projectiles struck the Valdorian pursuit ships from every direction. Mining charges detonated, sending massive rocks hurtling at tremendous velocities. The Valdorians found themselves surrounded by enemies they could not see and could not target. 200 ships entered the asteroid belt. 17 emerged. High Admiral Zorath stared at his tactical display with growing unease. He had lost nearly 300 vessels in the first hour of combat. He had not destroyed a single human ship. His crews were reporting confusion and fear. This was not the easy conquest they had, it's been promised. The remaining assault wave regrouped and continued toward Earth. They approached with more caution now, their sensors straining to detect hidden enemies. But the humans had more surprises waiting. Lieutenant Nicole Porter commanded a small research vessel called the Edison. She and her team had been working on an experimental gravity manipulation device designed for moving asteroids. In the 48 hours before the invasion, they had modified it into something far more dangerous. The Valdorian ships traveled in tight formation with their shields overlapping. This was standard defensive doctrine. Overlapping shields created a barrier that conventional weapons could not penetrate. It had protected Valdorian fleets for centuries. Nicole activated her device when the enemy formation crossed the lunar orbit. Space itself twisted and warped. The overlapping shields that were supposed to provide protection instead amplified the gravitational distortion. Ships were yanked toward each other with irresistible force. Vessels that had flown in perfect formation moments earlier collided and crumpled. 700 warships were destroyed in seconds. The surviving Valdorian ships scattered in panic. Their commanders screamed orders into communication systems that suddenly seemed sluggish and unreliable. Every command arrived 2 seconds late. Every response took 2 seconds too long. On Earth, a civilian programmer named Kevin Walsh had uploaded a virus into the Valdorian communication network using captured equipment from destroyed ships. The virus did not destroy anything. It simply introduced a tiny delay into every transmission. 2 seconds of lag that meant nothing in ordinary circumstances, but meant everything in the chaos of battle. Human pilots exploited the confusion ruthlessly. They attacked in small groups, striking fast and disappearing before the Valdorians could coordinate a response. They used asteroids as cover and moons as shields. They employed tactics that no Valdorian had ever encountered because no species had ever fought this way before. Captain Sam Rodriguez led the bomber wing that targeted the Valdorian supply ships. His squadron consisted of 12 civilian transports that had been loaded with nuclear weapons. The pilots knew they would not survive the mission. They volunteered anyway. They found the supply convoy behind the main fleet and attacked without hesitation. Valdorian escort ships tried to intercept them, but the human pilots flew with reckless abandon, accepting hits that would have made sane beings retreat. They reached their targets and detonated their payloads. 400 supply vessels vanished in nuclear fire. The Valdorian fleet lost the fuel and ammunition reserves needed for a prolonged campaign. Rodriguez transmitted his final message before his ship was destroyed. He said that humanity was just getting started. High Admiral Zoroth sat alone in his quarters that night, studying the casualty reports. He had lost over 1,500 ships in a single day. He had failed to land a single soldier on Earth. He had not even damaged the human planetary defenses. These creatures were unlike anything the Empire had faced before. They did not fight with honor or follow predictable patterns. They turned everything into a weapon. They sacrificed themselves without hesitation. They seemed to grow stronger as the battle progressed. Zoroth began to understand something that chilled him to his core. His species had learned warfare as a tool for expansion. For humans, warfare was survival itself. They had been shaped by conflict, since the first of their kind stood upright on the plains of their homeworld. The Empire had come to conquer primitives. They had found something far more dangerous instead. Third day of the invasion began with the Valdorian fleet regrouping beyond lunar orbit. High Admiral Zoroth had spent the night reviewing tactical data and consulting with his senior officers. They had lost nearly 2,000 ships. They had killed perhaps 100 humans. The mathematics of this war were moving in the wrong direction. But the Empire did not retreat. The Empire had never retreated. Zoroth reorganized his remaining forces and prepared for a second major assault. This time they would advance slowly and carefully. They would destroy every asteroid and satellite that might conceal a weapon. They would burn a path through space until nothing remained but Earth itself. On the surface of the moon, a team of human engineers worked frantically in an abandoned mining facility. Their leader was a woman named Grace Kim, who had spent 20 years designing industrial equipment. Now, she was building something that had never existed before. The Valdorians possessed energy shields that could absorb tremendous punishment. Human weapons could damage these shields but not destroy them quickly enough. Grace had studied the shield technology using fragments recovered from destroyed enemy vessels. She discovered something interesting. The shields operated on specific frequencies. They could be disrupted if struck by precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulses. The problem was generating pulses powerful enough to matter. Grace solved this problem by connecting every power generator in the lunar facility into a single massive weapon. The device would fire once and then burn out completely. But that single shot would be devastating. The Valdorian advance fleet approached the moon in a defensive formation. Their shields overlapped, and their weapons covered every approach. They had learned from earlier mistakes and moved with extreme caution. Grace waited until they were within optimal range and fired her weapon. The electromagnetic pulse swept across the enemy formation like an invisible wave. Every shield in its path flickered and died. For 17 seconds, 200 Valdorian warships were completely defenseless. Human vessels hidden on the dark side of the moon launched their attack the moment the shields. Railgun rounds and missiles struck unprotected hulls. Valdorian ships that had seemed invincible moments earlier shattered like glass. 160 vessels were destroyed before the surviving crews could restore their defensive systems. High Admiral Zoroth watched another piece of his fleet die and felt something he had never experienced before. It was doubt. He had commanded Valdorian forces for 60 years. He had conquered 11 worlds personally. He had never lost a battle. Now he was losing. A war against creatures who had been burning fossil fuels and killing each other with chemical explosives just a few generations ago. The humans continued their assault from every direction. They attacked supply lines and communication relays. They launched raids against damaged vessels that had fallen behind the main fleet. They used the debris fields from destroyed ships as cover for ambushes. A retired military officer named Patricia Lane coordinated the defense of the orbital stations circling Earth. These stations had been built for scientific research and manufacturing. Now, they served as fortresses. Patricia had spent 40 years studying military history. She knew every trick that human generals had used against superior enemies. She employed all of them. When Valdorian fighters approached a station, they found it surrounded by debris and wreckage that blocked their sensors. They had to slow down to navigate the obstacles. Human gunners hidden in the debris opened fire at point-blank range. When Valdorian capital ships targeted the stations with heavy weapons, the stations released swarms of decoys that mimicked their energy signatures. The Valdorians wasted their ammunition destroying empty targets, while the real stations positioned themselves. When Valdorian boarding parties attempted to capture a station, they found the corridors filled with traps and ambushes. Humans fought them in close quarters with weapons designed for exactly this kind of combat. The boarding parties were annihilated to the last soldier. On Earth, civilian population had transformed into a war machine. Factories produced weapons around the clock. Engineers designed new systems based on captured enemy technology. Scientists worked to understand Valdorian biology and psychology, searching for weaknesses that could be exploited. A young man named Derek Cole made a crucial discovery. He was a graduate student studying xenobiology who had been analyzing tissue samples from dead Valdorians. He found that their nervous systems were extremely sensitive to certain sound frequencies. Exposure to these frequencies caused disorientation and pain. Within hours, human vessels were equipped with sonic emitters. The weapons did not kill, but they disrupted Valdorian crews at critical moments. Gunners missed their targets. Pilots made navigation errors. Engineers failed to complete repairs. Every human contributed what they could. Hackers attacked Valdorian computer systems. Amateur astronomers tracked enemy movements. Ham radio operators coordinated resistance activities. Farmers converted their equipment into makeshift weapons platforms. Teachers organized evacuation routes for civilians. Children helped manufacture ammunition in school gymnasiums. The Valdorians had expected to fight a military force. Instead, they were fighting an entire species. Every human on Earth was a soldier. Every building was a potential fortress. Every piece of technology was a possible weapon. High Admiral Zorath attempted to establish a blockade around Earth and starve the humans into submission. But his fleet was too damaged and too demoralized to maintain the formation. Human raiders slipped through gaps in the cordon and struck vulnerable targets. A cargo pilot named Henry Dawson flew a transport ship loaded with explosives directly into a Valdorian command cruiser. He transmitted a message to his family before impact, telling them he loved them and asking them to remember what he died for. His sacrifice destroyed the cruiser and killed the admiral commanding the blockade sector. The blockade collapsed within hours. Zoroth received reports that his crews were experiencing psychological problems. Soldiers who had conquered worlds without hesitation now flinched at shadows. Officers who had commanded with confidence now second-guessed every decision. The humans had gotten inside their heads. Fear was spreading through the fleet like a disease. The Valdorians had always been the ones who inspired terror. Now they were experiencing it themselves. A Valdorian analyst presented a troubling assessment to the High Admiral. The humans were adapting faster than anticipated. They learned from every engagement and developed countermeasures within hours. They shared information across their entire species instantly. They improved their weapons continuously. Worse, they seemed to grow more dangerous as the war continued. Each defeat made them angrier. Each loss made them more determined. They did not break under pressure. They hardened. The analyst concluded with a warning that Zorith did not want to hear. If the current trends continued, the Valdorian fleet would be completely destroyed within 2 weeks. The humans would not merely survive, they would win. Zoroth dismissed the analyst and sat alone with his thoughts. He had come to Earth expecting an easy conquest. He had found a nightmare instead. These humans were monsters. They had turned their own violent nature into a weapon more terrible than anything the Valdorians possessed. They had spent 10,000 years learning to destroy each other. Now they had a common enemy, and they were just getting started. The 6th day of the invasion brought a council of war aboard the Valdorian flagship. High Admiral Zoroth assembled his surviving commanders in the Great Hall and demanded solutions. The situation had become desperate. Of the original 9,500 ships, only 6,000 remained capable of combat operations. They had not established a single foothold on Earth. They had not even achieved orbital superiority. Some commanders argued for tactical withdrawal. They could retreat to the outer system, request reinforcements from the Empire, and return with overwhelming force. It was the sensible choice. It was the choice that would preserve what remained of the fleet. Zoreth rejected this option. The Valdorian Empire had never retreated from a conquest. If they fled from these primitive humans, the news would spread across the galaxy. Subject species would question Valdorian invincibility. Rebellions might ignite on conquered worlds. The Empire itself might fracture. No, they would commit every remaining vessel to a final assault. They would overwhelm the human defenses through sheer numbers. They would burn Earth from orbit until nothing remained but ash and silence. The order went out to the fleet. 4,000 warships formed into a massive assault formation. They would advance together, shields interlocking, weapons covering every approach. No more cautious probing. No more divided forces. This would be the killing blow. Admiral Daniel Carter received the sensor reports and understood immediately. The Valdorians were committing everything to one final push. They were abandoning tactics in favor of brute force. They believed that numbers alone would secure victory. Carter smiled grimly. The aliens still did not understand what they were fighting. He ordered the activation of Project Lazarus for 50 years. Humanity had been launching satellites into Earth's orbit, communication relays, weather monitors, research platforms, navigation beacons. The Valdorians had scanned these objects upon arrival and dismissed them as primitive civilian infrastructure. They had made a critical error every satellite in Earth orbit contained. Concealed weapons systems, directed energy projectors disguised as solar panels, kinetic launchers hidden inside sensor arrays, missile tubes built into structural supports, 15,000 platforms transformed from peaceful tools into instruments of war. General Amy Patterson coordinated the ground-based defense network from a bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains. She had spent 30 years planning for an alien invasion that most people believed would never happen. Now her preparations would be tested. Railgun installations hidden in mountains across 6 continents powered up their capacitors. Laser arrays designed for deflecting asteroids adjusted their targeting systems. Missile silos that had once held nuclear weapons now contained warheads designed for space combat. Every major city had become a fortress. Every military base had become an arsenal. The Valdorian assault fleet approached Earth in perfect formation. 4,000 ships advanced like an iron tide, their crews confident that nothing could stop such overwhelming force. Project Lazarus activated when they crossed the engagement threshold. 15,000 satellites opened fire simultaneously. Beams of concentrated energy slashed through Valdorian shields. Kinetic projectiles punched through armored holes. Missiles swarmed toward engine sections and weapons batteries. The leading edge of the assault formation dissolved into expanding clouds of debris. The ground-based weapons joined the attack moments later. Railgun rounds accelerated to hypersonic velocities by electromagnetic launchers streaked into space. They struck with the force of small nuclear explosions. Valdorian ships that had survived the satellite barrage were torn apart by projectiles they never saw coming. But the aliens kept advancing. They had committed to this attack and would not withdraw. Their commanders ordered all shields forward and all weapons focused on the human defenses. They would absorb the losses and push through. Admiral Carter had anticipated this response. He ordered the second phase of the defense. The human fleet emerged from concealment behind the moon and attacked the Valdorian rear. 300 vessels struck with everything they had. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with the fury of a species defending its home. Commander Kate Morrison led the fighter squadrons that harassed the Valdorian flanks. Her pilots flew with reckless courage, weaving between enemy capital ships and striking at vulnerable points. They took terrible losses, but they bought precious time for the ground defenses to reload. Lisa Grant coordinated the electronic warfare effort from a mobile command center. Her team had spent the last 6 days studying captured Valdorian systems and developing countermeasures. Now they deployed everything they had learned. Valdorian targeting systems received false data showing human ships in empty space. Navigation computers calculated routes that led directly into defensive fire zones. Communication networks filled with garbage data that made coordination impossible. The Valdorian assault became a chaos of confusion and death. But the true power of humanity was not in its weapons or tactics. It was in the people themselves. A retired school teacher named Susan Price operated an anti-aircraft battery in the plains of Kansas. She had learned to use the weapon 3 days earlier. She destroyed 17 Valdorian fighters before enemy fire disabled her position. A 16-year-old coding prodigy named Matt Coleman broke into the Valdorian tactical network and disabled the targeting systems of an entire squadron. He worked from his bedroom while his mother brought him sandwiches and coffee. A grandmother in Florida, named Betty Ross, used her amateur radio equipment to coordinate resistance fighters across 3 continents. She had been a radio operator in her youth and remembered skills she thought she had forgotten. A factory worker named Carlos Mendez drove a truck loaded with missiles to a launcher that had run out of ammunition. Enemy fighters strafed the road the entire way. He delivered his cargo and drove back for more. A doctor named Priya Sharma operated on wounded soldiers in a hospital basement while bombs fell overhead. She saved 47 lives that day. An astronaut named Jack Murphy flew a damaged shuttle directly into a Valdorian cruiser when his weapons failed. His last transmission was a joke about always wanting to see the inside of an alien spaceship. They fought without sleep and without rest. They fought through wounds and exhaustion and despair. They fought because their families were behind them and their world was at stake. The Valdorians had superior technology and greater numbers, but they could not match the terrible determination of a species fighting for survival. Admiral Zoreth watched his tactical display and saw his fleet dying. Ships that had conquered worlds were burning around him. Crews that had never known defeat were screaming in terror. The assault had become a slaughter. He had committed 4,000 ships to this attack. He had lost half of them in the first 3 hours. The human defenses showed no sign of weakening. If anything, they seemed to grow stronger as the battle progressed. For the first time in his 60-year career, Zoreth considered the unthinkable. He might lose. Not just this battle, everything. His fleet, his reputation, his life. These humans would not stop. They would never stop. They would fight until every last one of them was dead. And even then, Zoreth suspected their ghosts would keep fighting. He gave the order to withdraw. The surviving Valdorian ships broke formation and fled toward the outer system. They abandoned their wounded comrades and left their dead behind. They ran like prey animals fleeing a predator. Behind them, humanity watched and waited and prepared for whatever came next. The battle for Earth lasted 9 days when the guns finally fell silent. The space around humanity's homeworld had become a graveyard. Thousands of Valdorian warships drifted without power, their hulls torn open and their crews dead at their stations. Debris fields stretched for millions of kilometers, glittering in the sunlight like a river of broken glass. The wreckage would take decades to clear. High Admiral Zorith stood on the bridge of his damaged flagship and counted what remained of his invasion force. 9,500 ships had entered the human system. 17 remained capable of faster-than-light travel. 17 ships from a fleet that had conquered worlds. He had never experienced failure before. The sensation was strange and bitter. His entire career had been built on victory. His entire species believed themselves invincible. Now he would return home with proof that they were not. Admiral Daniel Carter received the transmission request from the Valdorian flagship. He was exhausted beyond description. He had not slept more than a few hours total since the invasion began. His uniform was stained with blood and smoke. His voice was hoarse from shouting orders. But he straightened his shoulders and accepted the communication. Zorith appeared on the view screen. The alien admiral looked older than he had 9 days earlier. His confidence had been replaced by something that might have been respect or might have been fear, perhaps both. He requested terms for withdrawal. His remaining ships needed to leave human space with their wounded and their records of what had happened here. He offered whatever assurances Carter required. Carter considered the request. Part of him wanted to destroy those 17 ships. Part of him wanted to make the Valdorians pay for every human life they had taken. Part of him wanted vengeance, but another part understood something more important. Those 17 ships would return to the Valdorian Empire. They would carry tales of what had happened at Earth. They would spread word of a species that could not be conquered. Carter responded with a single word that humans had used for centuries when dealing with defeated enemies: unconditional. Zora accepted. He had no choice. His fleet was broken and his crews were shattered. He transmitted his formal surrender and requested permission to depart. Carter granted it. The 17 surviving Valdorian ships limped toward the edge of the solar system. They moved slowly, their engines damaged and their crews traumatized. It would take them weeks to reach safe faster-than-light distance. Human vessels escorted them to the boundary, not to attack, but to make certain they understood. Every kilometer of their retreat was watched. Every moment of their flight was recorded. They were leaving because humanity allowed them to leave. Nothing more. On Earth, the celebrations were muted by grief. Humanity had won an impossible victory, but the cost had been terrible. Millions had died in the fighting. Cities had been damaged. Orbital stations had been destroyed. The scars would take generations to heal, but they had survived. Against all odds, against all logic, against an enemy with overwhelming superiority in numbers and technology, they had survived. Admiral Carter stood on the observation deck of his battered flagship and watched the last Valdorian ships disappear into the darkness. Commander Kate Morrison joined him, her own exhaustion evident in her posture. She asked what he thought would happen next. Carter considered the question carefully. Humanity had revealed itself to the galaxy. They had demonstrated that they could not be conquered through force. The Valdorian Empire would remember this defeat. Other powers would learn of it. Some would come seeking alliance with this dangerous new species. Others would come seeking to destroy them before they became too powerful. The universe had just become much more complicated, but Carter found that he was not afraid. Humanity had spent its entire existence preparing for this moment, even without knowing it. Every war they had fought against each other had taught them something. Every conflict had sharpened their instincts and refined their tactics. Every terrible lesson written in blood had forged them into something unique. A species born in violence. A species shaped by struggle. A species that refused to accept defeat under any circumstances. The Valdorians had possessed superior technology and greater numbers. They had possessed experience conquering worlds and breaking civilizations. They had possessed everything except the one thing that mattered most. They had not possessed the will to win at any cost. Humans did. Humans always had. It was written in their genes and carved into their souls. They would fight and bleed and die rather than surrender. They would sacrifice everything to protect their own. They would endure horrors that would break other species and emerge stronger for the experience. Carter smiled grimly. Let the galaxy take notice. Let empires and federations and ancient powers observe what had happened here. Let them see the wreckage of 9,500 warships and understand what it meant. Earth was not a soft target. Earth was not an easy conquest. Earth was the home of the most dangerous species the universe had ever produced. The 17 surviving ships would carry this message back to the Valdorian Empire. They would describe the impossible defeat. They would explain how a primitive species with inferior technology had destroyed the greatest invasion fleet ever assembled. They would warn their masters that humans were not to be challenged, and the warning would spread. From the Valdorians to their subject species, from system to system, and empire to empire, the story would grow with each retelling. The legend would take shape in an unremarkable corner of an average galaxy. There existed a small blue planet called Earth. The creatures who lived there seemed primitive and divided, always fighting amongst themselves over trivial matters. But when threatened by outside forces, they transformed into something terrifying. They became unified. They became creative. They became relentless. They became humanity. High Admiral Zorith made his final log entry as his ship crossed into interstellar space. His words were simple and honest. He had been tasked with conquering a primitive world. He had encountered something that defied his understanding. He had faced beings who treated warfare not as a tool, but as an art form perfected over countless generations. He had lost. His final recommendation was clear. The Valdorian Empire should never attempt to conquer Earth again. The cost would be too high. The humans would only grow stronger. They were learning and adapting faster than any species the Empire had ever encountered. Given time, they might become a threat to the Empire itself. The transmission ended. The 17 ships vanished into the void, carrying their cargo of wounded survivors and terrible memories. Behind them, on a small blue world still burning in places, humanity began to rebuild. They mourned their dead and tended their wounded. They repaired their defenses and improved their weapons. They looked up at the stars with new eyes. They were no longer alone in the universe.